Whence then came the animating spirit, the soul? Logic was pointing the way to me now with a vengeance. If the Egyptian belief was true for Egyptians, then the Ka of the dead Queen and her Khu could animate what she might choose. In such case Margaret would not be an individual at all, but simply a phase of Queen Tera herself, an astral body obedient to her will. Here I revolted against logic. Every fibre of my being resented such a conclusion. How could I believe that there was no Margaret at all, but just an animated image used by the double of a woman of 40 centuries ago to its own ends? Somehow the outlook was brighter to me now, despite the new doubts. At least I had Margaret. Back swung the logical pendulum again. The child, then, was not dead. If so, had the sorceress had anything to do with her birth at all? It was evident, so I took it again from Corbeck, that there was a strange likeness between Margaret and the pictures of Queen Tera. How could this be? It could not be any birthmark reproducing what had been in the mother's mind, for Mrs. Trelawny had never seen the pictures. Nay, even her father had not seen them till he had found his way into the tomb only a few days before her birth. This phase I could not get rid of so easily as the last. The fibres of my being remained quiet. There remained to me the horror of doubt. And even then, so strange is the mind of man, doubt itself took a concrete image, a vast and impenetrable gloom, through which flickered irregularly and spasmodically tiny points of evanescent light, which seemed to quicken the darkness into a positive existence. The remaining possibility of relations between Margaret and the mummied Queen was, that in some occult way the sorceress had power to change places with the other. This view of things could not be so lightly thrown aside. There were too many suspicious circumstances to warrant this, now that my attention was fixed on it and my intelligence recognized the possibility. Hereupon there began to come into my mind all the strange, incomprehensible matters which had whirled through our lives in the last few days. At first they all crowded in upon me in a jumbled mass. But again the habit of mind of my working life prevailed, and they took order. I found it now easier to control myself, for there was something to grasp, some work to be done, though it was of a sorry kind, for it was or might be antagonistic to Margaret. But Margaret was herself at stake. I was thinking of her and fighting for her, and yet if I were to work in the dark, I might be even harmful to her. My first weapon in her defense was truth. I must know and understand. I might then be able to act. Certainly I could not act beneficently without a just conception and recognition of the facts. Arranged in order, these were as follows. Firstly, the strange likeness of Queen Tera to Margaret, who had been born in another country 1,000 miles away, where her mother could not possibly have had even a passing knowledge of her appearance. Secondly, the disappearance of Van Huyn's book when I had read up to the description of the star ruby. Thirdly, the finding of the lamps in the boudoir. Tera, with her astral body, could have unlocked the door of Corbeck's room in the hotel, and have locked it again after her exit with the lamps. She could in the same way have opened the window, and put the lamps in the boudoir. It need not have been that Margaret in her own person should have had any hand in this; but it was at least strange. Fourthly, here the suspicions of the detective and the Doctor came back to me with renewed force, and with a larger understanding. Fifthly, there were the occasions on which Margaret foretold with accuracy the coming occasions of quietude, as though she had some conviction or knowledge of the intentions of the astral-bodied Queen. Sixthly, There was her suggestion of the finding of the ruby which her father had lost. As I thought now afresh over this episode in the light of suspicion in which her own powers were involved, the only conclusion I could come to was—always supposing that the theory of the Queen's astral power was correct—that Queen Tera, being anxious that all should go well in the movement from London to Kyllion, had in her own way taken the jewel from Mr. Trelawny's pocket-book, finding it of some use in her supernatural guardianship of the journey. Then in some mysterious way she had, through Margaret, made the suggestion of its loss and finding. Seventhly, and lastly, was the strange dual existence which Margaret seemed of late to be leading, and which in some way seemed a consequence or corollary of all that had gone before. The dual existence! This was indeed the conclusion which overcame all difficulties and reconciled opposites. If indeed Margaret were not in all ways a free agent, but could be compelled to speak or act as she might be instructed; or if her whole being could be changed for another without the possibility of anyone noticing the doing of it, then all things were possible. All would depend on the spirit of the individuality by which she could be so compelled. If this individuality were just and kind and clean, all might be well. But if not— The thought was too awful for words. I ground my teeth with futile rage as the ideas of horrible possibilities swept through me. Up to this morning Margaret's lapses into her new self had been few and hardly noticeable, save when once or twice her attitude towards myself had been marked by a bearing strange to me. But today the contrary was the case, and the change presaged badly. It might be that that other individuality was of the lower, not the better sort. Now that I thought of it, I had reason to fear. In the history of the mummy, from the time of Van Huyn's breaking into the tomb, the record of deaths that we knew of, presumably effected by her will and agency, was a startling one. The Arab who had stolen the hand from the mummy, and the one who had taken it from his body. The Arab chief who had tried to steal the jewel from Van Huyn, and whose throat bore the marks of 7 fingers. The 2 men found dead on the first night of Trelawny's taking away the sarcophagus; and the 3 on the return to the tomb. The Arab who had opened the secret serdab. 9 dead men, one of them slain manifestly by the Queen's own hand. And beyond this again, the several savage attacks on Mr. Trelawny in his own room, in which, aided by her familiar, she had tried to open the safe and to extract the talisman jewel. His device of fastening the key to his wrist by a steel bangle, though successful in the end, had well nigh cost him his life. If then the Queen, intent on her resurrection under her own conditions, had, so to speak, waded to it through blood, what might she not do were her purpose thwarted? What terrible step might she not take to effect her wishes? Nay, what were her wishes? What was her ultimate purpose? As yet we had had only Margaret's statement of them, given in all the glorious enthusiasm of her lofty soul. In her record there was no expression of love to be sought or found. All we knew for certain was that she had set before her the object of resurrection, and that in it the North, which she had manifestly loved, was to have a special part. But that the resurrection was to be accomplished in the lonely tomb in the Valley of the Sorcerer was apparent. All preparations had been carefully made for accomplishment from within, and for her ultimate exit in her new and living form. The sarcophagus was unlidded. The oil jars, though hermetically sealed, were to be easily opened by hand, and in them provision was made for shrinkage through a vast period of time. Even flint and steel were provided for the production of flame. The mummy